you all for being here. I'm Zoe Saunders, the Interim Secretary of Education. I'm really delighted to be with you tonight. This is part of the Agency of Education's Listen and Learn Tour. And what to expect from this meeting is we'll go through a brief presentation, which will include our goals for the Listen and Learn Tour, along with a brief data overview, and then we'll break up into small groups and have further conversations so that you can help to inform our planning. So I'll start by explaining the role of the Agency of Education. The Agency of Education does not set policy or make laws. That is the job of the General Assembly. However, we are often called upon to testify to the General Assembly as they're considering new legislation. And as we do that work, it's important that we're grounding those recommendations in data and research, and also considerations around implementation, which is part of the reason we're engaging in this way through our Listen and Learn Tour, to be very deeply engaged and embedded in the field. The AOE is responsible for implementing policy, and is the only statewide agency that is charged with ensuring the delivery of equitable education across Vermont and implementing federal and state laws. It's really, I think, a point of pride for us to recognize that education is the only government service included in the state's constitution. I think reinforces the importance that Vermonters place on education. So the role of the Agency of Education, we are able to take a statewide view of education performance. This positions us in a way to help facilitate planning across the state and identifying best practices that can be leveraged and supported in other parts of our community. We do oversee the implementation of state and federal education laws and manage over $2 billion annually in state and federal funds that districts receive to provide additional support for student learning. We are the repository of a broad range of data. I think we last calculated we report over 400 different data reports for various entities, but part of our work in our planning process is to really become more focused on how we use that data to drive decision making, and so we're starting with a series of reports, and we'll share more about that today. So just to set the stage for the evening, as we're doing this work and developing the agency's strategic plan, we are really focused on promoting equity, educational quality, and sustainability. It's important for us to hear from Vermonters across the state to really get this right and make sure that we're developing a plan that is aligned to community needs and really resonates with Vermonters. So when you came in, I know you were able to scan a QR code to share with us who's in the room. So we're just going to take a moment to reflect on that. I always think it's great to see the diverse perspectives that we're bringing into these conversations. So it looks like today, thank you, Amanda. It looks like today we have some of our educators, parents, a legislator, community members, and some others. And I always think the other is interesting because it's probably because you wear so many hats that it's hard to define yourself into any one of these categories. We also asked you to choose top 3 topics of interest. So it looks like maybe the highest point is covered there. So academic performance is coming out as a big focus for those in the room today, followed by college and career readiness and equitable access for all students. So these are certainly topics that we will look to address in part of our planning today, and we know that there will be some other priorities that emerge through our conversations as well. We also asked you just to reflect on your overall level of engagement with your local school and school district. And no surprise here, many of you who are here today and taking the time out of your evening feel very invested and engaged in your schools and school districts. So wonderful to hear that. And we'll go back to the slides. Thank you, Amanda. I appreciate the tech support. Thank you. So I'll start by sharing a little bit of background on what is the Listen and Learn Tour. This is a process by which the Agency of Education is developing our strategic plan. We've designed this process to be very participatory and data-driven and make sure that we're involving members of our AOE team, community, and education leaders in this process. We've identified 5 goals through the Listen and Learn Tour. The first is that the Agency of Education aims to align our work to regional and local priorities. By engaging stakeholders with immediate knowledge of the challenges and opportunities that students and educators face every day, will help the agency better tailor our support towards effective solutions. Second, the Listen and Learn Tour will help identify a shared understanding of how the agency can most effectively support high-quality teaching and learning. Third, this collaborative process will ultimately inform changes that expand students' access to high-quality educational opportunities. And fourth, by providing opportunities to review data and share innovative practices, the Listen and Learn Tour will identify key opportunities for improving student achievement. Finally, the Listen and Learn Tour will help the Agency of Education to develop a strategic plan that meets the state's immediate priorities while supporting the future statewide vision for public education in Vermont. Immediate priorities include supporting landmark legislation, helping struggling school districts, and providing training and support for this budgeting cycle. We've organized the Listen and Learn Tour into 3 phases. Phase 1 focused on collecting and analyzing data. In August, we released the state profile report, and we will be re-releasing that report in the coming weeks to provide some expanded information and additional context. Also in that re-release will be additional details in the appendix that will help those who are interested in recreating the analysis and being able to do some additional deep dives that might be helpful for you to look at from your community perspective. Also in phase 1 of the process, we worked with our superintendents in helping to really design this approach in a way that was going to be most impactful. One of the first questions we asked was, how do we engage in regional planning? And how do we define that as a state in Vermont? So what we relied on was the Regional Superintendents Association has defined boundaries that they use to collaborate among their superintendents and other leaders in the area. And we chose to organize our planning around those particular regions because many educators are already collaborating in those spaces together. In phase 2, we facilitated planning sessions in those regions, and we hosted sessions in 6 different sessions across the state, involved over 250 educators that included superintendents, principals, curriculum directors, business managers, special education directors, and school board members as well to engage in that process. Today I'll share a little bit around what we learned from the regional planning. We certainly identified some local nuances and also surfaced some common themes to focus on statewide. And phase 3 is our public engagement session, which you are a part of, and we're really delighted to have you here today to really continue to provide input for us on those areas that are most important to focus on. A few key takeaways from the regional sessions included a desire for stronger and more accessible community partnerships with schools, clearer data to show student achievement and opportunities, which we'll explore today, and more state resources for community members to learn about the budget and the overall education finance system. These are all things the AOE is actively working to address. And we are starting a budget learning series to help taxpayers gain a clearer understanding of how school budgets and education funding in Vermont works. As we only have a few short hours today, we'll focus on hearing about what you value in your schools and what concerns you may have and hopes that you have for the future as well. One of the other key takeaways that we had was really creating a balance for the need for local autonomy and customization and decision making, while also hearing a desire for the Agency of Education to provide clearer and more direct guidance on very specific things that are important to driving academic improvement. So just share what will come next. I mentioned already that we will re-release the state profile report with some expanded information. We are hosting a number of public engagement sessions, both in person and virtual. So if you know of friends or colleagues that are interested in participating, please share that there'll be other ways for them to get involved and provide their input. We also are hosting additional sessions for our educators and are doing those in person and also virtually. We will be releasing soon the summaries from the regional planning that we heard. We think this is really important to look at both quantitative and qualitative data. Today we'll focus a lot on the quantitative data, but we understand that the themes that are emerging through our discussions across the state are also important to bring into our planning so we can contextualize that data and really develop solutions and initiatives that will be both supportive. Our education system is very complex. And so we also recognize the need to do more refined reporting on specific aspects of the education system. We're calling those topical reports. So topical reports might include a focus on a deep dive on education finance, or a deep dive on our special education system, or on college and career readiness. And so as we're doing our planning with the community and with the educators, we'll be prioritizing the sequencing of those reports over the next year. All of this will help to inform the agency's strategic plan, which will be a multi-year plan with specific goals and initiatives to address these priority areas. I want to make a couple notes just as we frame the conversation today. First, I want to recognize everyone here is deeply committed to education, and we value your participation, taking time out of your day. We, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, Vermont is really unique in the level of investment in education that we place, level of investment and commitment to education, and just want to really acknowledge and celebrate that. We also know that topics around discussions in education can raise really strong feelings and emotions, and that in our conversations today we may not all agree, but that it is really important to be able to create an environment where we can share our ideas, share questions, and also offer suggestions for further exploration. Our conversation this evening will focus on defining success for our students and how the Agency of Education can support schools to ensure that every student has access to high-quality educational opportunities. There are probably some of you here today that are interested also in discussing our education finance system, and we will provide a very high-level overview of our education finance system, but recognize that these short slides you won't leave as an expert in our system, but that there will be further training around that. But we'll share some additional background just to provide a framing for this conversation. We also know that there are a number of topics that you might be really eager to talk about. We want to make note of those as we go through our discussions later today. Of course, as we ask as we engage in those breakout sessions that people are really respectful of the different views and create a really open environment where we focus on opportunities for positive change and positive improvements. So what we'll do next is I'm going to turn it over to my partner over here, Amanda, to walk through some of the data that was included in the state profile report. I'm joined today by members of my team at the Agency of Education, so if you all could wave, thank you for being here. And also our partners that we've got contracted with at APA to walk through some of the data and support our facilitation today. So with that, I will turn it over to Amanda.
Hi everyone. So as Zoe was saying, I want to give a brief overview of some of the key kind of takeaways and highlights that were coming out of that data review we've done. So as was mentioned, I think there's 400 different data collections, so we're pulling a lot of different data together in a way for the first time. So again, I want to hit some highlights. There'll be more depth in that statewide profile if you want to take a look at that. But the first thing I want to start off by framing is there's different ways in Vermont to think about the number of students in schools. So there's a couple different things. So we're going to talk about at different points in the presentation. So the first being enrollment. And so enrollment is the number of students that are served in an SU, so a supervisory union or supervisory districts, their actual schools. But there are also settings where they spend funds on sending students to other settings, so to independent schools, to say a high school in another SU or in another state even. And those we think about as part of the number of students that an SU, or again, supervisory district, is responsible for. So again, who are they serving in their physical buildings? Who are they also responsible for the education of, even if they don't serve them in their own schools? And then there's another piece we'll talk about, what we call equalized students, which is how the funding system tries to differentiate and account for the different expected costs of serving students, which is a different count of students. So we're going to refer to kind of 3 different ways of thinking about kids over the course of this evening. And I'm going to try to be very clear on which one we're talking about at which point. So what I want to share on this slide is thinking about where are publicly funded students. So of those, there's 80,000 students that are enrolled in Vermont schools, public schools. There is another 2,000 students that are enrolled, they're publicly tuitioned, so paid for by public dollars, that are attending private academies. There's about another 600 that attend therapeutic schools, and those are really for special education students. And then finally, another 800 or so students that are in other approved independent school settings. So altogether, that's about 84,000 students that are publicly funded in Vermont in the different places they reside. And the big takeaway I want you to also see in that pie chart is that the vast majority of them are served in Vermont public schools. So the next piece is thinking about the governance. So those 80,000 students, so the ones of our students that are served in public schools, reside in about 287 schools, which are in 118 districts, which are then grouped together in these supervisory unions or supervisory districts. And there's just over 50 of those. It was 51 in 2022-23. There's actually an additional one if you looked at this information today. So that's how we organize our students in our schools in the state. And what you see in the map is a bit of just how SUs are laid out across the state. So you can see they vary in size from being very small geographically to large geographically. And they also range in size, which would be that scaled. It's a little harder to see on how this is displaying, but from about 200 students to about 4,000 students in an SU. So very different across the state. And you can see each of the different regions that we were talking about earlier, kind of where those are in the state as well. So staying with this idea of enrollment, so again, the kids served in our public schools, we wanted to look at trends over time. So the very top line that you see up there is those kind of 80,000 students that are there now, so your total enrollment in public schools. But what we can see is that has really declined over this period of time, say the past 20 years or so. Most of that change has occurred kind of pre-pandemic. But what's also interesting to see here, to look at a couple of those dotted lines. So the first one being K-12. We actually see the biggest decline in K-12, about 20%, but that's somewhat offset by an increase in preschool enrollment that we're seeing. And that's the number of preschool students served in public school settings. And I just want to clarify, that might not represent a demographic shift, so it might not be more preschool students in the state, but really more slots and spots available for those students to be served. And then the other 2 pieces that are interesting is to look at independent schools. So that thick red line is the number of publicly and privately funded students. So about that 4,000 kids we saw on the last page, there's additional kids that are privately funded. And what we see when we look at both that and the home study, which is kind of the blue line, is we see increases of in those students that kind of peaked during the pandemic, but have come down a little bit, but still a little higher than they were pre-pandemic. So just again, getting a sense of where are students served in both public schools and other settings in the state. And there was a great question earlier, why some of the lines are shorter. And that was just the data we had available. Some of this information we don't have readily available historically. Okay, so then we also tried to situate where is Vermont in the context of other states in the nation. So the first few places we looked at that information were size of school, staff, and expenditure. So when we look at that, it probably doesn't surprise anyone that Vermont has pretty small schools. If you look nationally, it's about 46 in terms of having the smallest schools, which is then kind of related to it having both the highest number of staff and number of teachers per student. So, which then relates to that kind of final bullet, that it has the 5th highest expenditures per pupil compared to other states. And I will caveat that a little bit. Some of the highest spenders, the ones that would also be at the top of the list, are also your neighboring states. So there's also a cost of living and a regional piece to that puzzle. So one more national comparison we looked at is the National Assessment of Education Performance. So this is the NAEP assessment. It is a common assessment that's given to students across the country to a sample of students in 4th grade and 8th grade. So it's the only kind of assessment data point that we can compare state to state. So when we look at that, we see that Vermont is actually pretty well in reading. So it's kind of 5th highest and 11th highest, so the top for reading in those grades, but then more in the middle, kind of when you look at math. And the other piece of that is when we looked at that over time, so about the last 10 years, we do see Vermont's overall performance kind of trending more to the national average. And one more piece of the assessment puzzle, and this is shifting gears from that national assessment to our own state assessments, looking at 2 years of information, so kind of 18-19 and 22-23, which are 2 different assessments, we're seeing persistent achievement gaps for certain groups of students. So what you see on this chart, kind of working left to right, is all students, your free and reduced lunch, which would be your kind of economically disadvantaged students, your English language learners, and then your special education students. So while that prior slide really gave us that national picture about how Vermont students are doing, this shows that even if we're doing very well overall comparatively to other states, we're still seeing gaps over time on different tests and at different grades for our kiddos. Okay, and then obviously funding comes into the picture. So what we're gonna see here is expenditures, so the money being spent by schools, expressed as per ADM. So that ADM we touched on a little bit ago is average daily membership, or the number of students that a supervisor union is responsible for. So it also includes those tuitioned kids. So not just the kids in their building, but they spend dollars on those kids. So we look at that, and we see that spending has increased from about 22,000 to 27,000 over this period of time. And there's a couple pieces to that puzzle. One is that between what you see called FY20, which is fiscal year 20, and fiscal year 23, were also pandemic impacted years. And there was quite a bit of federal funding available to offset the impact of the pandemic for our schools. So you can see that federal funding sources, which is that kind of light blue color, went from 5% to 11%. So it about doubled in how much money the federal government was putting into education. So that's one piece of that increase that we're seeing. But when you also look at that green bar at the bottom, you do see that even at an absolute level has continued to increase. And that's your local and state spending on education. And then if we looked at that by kind of size of setting, so working from kind of this left group, which is under 1,000 students, to the right group, which is over 2,000 students, we see that you spend more in smaller settings, which is not unexpected due to different economies of scale that exist there. So sometimes you have fixed costs that have to be spread out over a limited number of students. So not unexpected there. A couple things I'll note is that there's also a couple outliers in that smallest group that we're looking into. So even with them removed, it would still show that same story, that there's more spending in smaller settings. So we're looking into that just to clarify there. And also those settings tend to serve a higher percentage of free and reduced lunch students and special education students. English learners is a little more sporadic, kind of statewide in who's served. So it's both a difference we're seeing because of size and also because of needs served in those settings. So keep that in mind. Okay, this is the most complicated part of the presentation to explain is how the funding system works in Vermont. So the first thing I want to start off with is just the timeline. So you get a sense of all the different moving pieces that are in it and all the different kind of agents or actors that are involved in the process. So starting at the very top, on or before December 1st, the tax commissioner projects education tax rates for the next fiscal year. So then from there, school boards develop those budgets that are then voted on by their local community. The legislature then sets the yields and base education tax rates at a level that is necessary to generate the level of funding to cover those voter-approved budgets. The tax department then calculates the rates and sends those to towns. The tax department also sets a spending-adjusted homestead tax rate for each town on or before June 20th. And then from there, towns send the tax bill to property owners on a local schedule. And then the final piece of that cycle is the schools receive payments at multiple points during the year to cover those voter-approved budget expenses. So again, we're seeing a few different actors and agents really involved in that process in different points throughout the year. So then, again, coming back to this idea that there's these local budgets that are developed by communities, they're also situated in a statewide funding system, which means there's a lot of interaction between what's happening locally in one place to another. So what you can see here is a good example of how this plays out. So we have 3 districts. The first one increased their budget, their second kept it the same, and the third decreased. So a taxpayer in each of these communities might expect that our budget increased, so my tax rate will increase, my tax burden. If it was stable, it might stay the same. If we decreased our budget, it should go down. But because of this interrelationship, because the state pulls all funding at the state level, there's, again, interplay between them. So overall, the state budget amount of funding needed for education went up, even if it didn't go up in every community, which in turn, because every Vermonter pays for every student in the state's education, it can raise the tax burden for individuals in districts that actually didn't change their budget or decrease their budget. So again, there's a lot of that interplay and connectivity in how the state funds education. And there's a couple pieces that can also impact individuals' tax bills that might not show up in this. And that's property value adjustments. So even the state adjusts tax rates to reflect current market value of properties. So if property values have increased, even if assessed values haven't changed, taxes will go up. And so changes in that adjustment can increase independent of your school's budget. And there can also be differences due to changes in student population and then the weighting of those students. Because again, our system tries to weight and count students in a way to let them spend extra dollars on certain student groups to address their need. So higher per pupil spending can raise tax rates even if the total budget decreases or stay the same if the student population changes during that time. And all of this can just impact the amount of per pupil spending and increase tax rates. And last piece of this puzzle is the current system is very intentionally designed following the court decision to make sure that the system adjusts for schools that serve students with higher needs, so English learners, economically disadvantaged students, in a way that allows them to spend more per pupil without triggering a greater tax burden for the local community. So in theory, this makes it possible for schools that serve students with greater needs to have larger budgets. So it can prioritizes student needs and not a community's ability to pay. However, it makes it just more complex, and again, it leads to that interrelatedness that makes it really hard to communicate what's happening in the system to local communities. So that's an effort that the AOE is tackling, as was mentioned before, to really be able to explain it better, because these 3 slides are not going to do it. It takes a lot more to really wrap your heads around what's going on there, at least for me. And the final slide is where, this slide is just to try to orientate you to what we're going to see on the next slide, where we're trying to bring together some of this information. So we've talked about what does size look like, what does need, what does performance and spending. So what does it mean when it all comes together? What this slide is going to show us for one of the subjects is the percent of students that were proficient or above against how much they were spending per equalized student. And again, equalized is how the funding system thinks about the count of students in a setting. So then we look at, are they spending higher or lower than the average? Are they performing higher or lower than the average? And that's how we assign them to one of these quadrants. And so on the next slide, you're going to see a little circle for every SU. And that circle will tell you 2 more things, because this is the most complicated chart on the planet. It will tell you both the size of the setting, looking at that average daily membership, and the need. So the bigger the circle, the bigger the setting. And then color-wise, if it's more green, it means it has lower need compared to one that's more red is higher need. Okay, so staying with me now, we're gonna get to the circles. Okay, so when we look at this, I think everyone's first instinct is to ask, well, where's my circle in this? But the goal is to really look at bigger systems trends. What do we see for our system and our state as a whole? What does that mean for how AOE might provide support? Where is it needed? How's our funding system working? Again, we're thinking very big systems with this picture. But what we see is some kind of big ticket, kind of high level takeaways. Or when we look in that upper quadrant, so the higher performing, lower spending, those places tend to have less student need when you look at economically disadvantaged students. So that top left corner, because we're seeing a lot of green circles, that tells us there's lower need there. When we look at perhaps the lower performing, lower spending, we tend to see higher student need in both quadrants of the lower performing. You see more red circles, you see more darker orange. So again, that tells us more of our settings with need have lower performance. And then larger settings, the larger circles, tend to be a little lower spending, but it's not a perfect pattern there. But again, this is just one way of starting to think about bringing this information all together to think about it. So that was a very high-level overview of lots of different pieces. I hope everyone retained everything.
You did a great job. In addition to the Listen and Learn tour, we will also be providing more targeted training in the field, and that will be inclusive of training around school budgets. And so we're looking at this both from a short-term perspective and long-term. And so in the short term, we will be hosting training series both for education leaders and also to support strategic budgeting decisions with our partners in the field to talk about cost-effective practices, also to really be able to communicate what is built into the budget. And the Agency of Education wants to be a very strong partner in this. One of the ways we've heard to do this is help to communicate how our system works to voters. So we'll be providing some more information in very plain language to build a deeper understanding of our system. In the long term, I want to put this in context. As the Agency of Education is developing our strategic plan, many state leaders and the Commission on the Future of Public Education and educators and legislators are contemplating improvements to our education system. And as we look at those different opportunities, there's ways for us to think about how we model those potential changes and think about how they can improve student outcomes and also support a very sustainable system. So moving forward as we continue our work in partnership with those various entities, we're looking to leverage our consultants to do some modeling and help us as a state understand the outcomes and also some implementation considerations and thinking about how we put those strategies within the Vermont context to ensure that they're most supportive of the needs of our learners across the state. As the Agency of Education does participate on a number of legislative committees, including the Commission on the Future of Public Education, the School Construction Aid Working Group, the Pre-K Implementation Committee, the After School Committee, the Literacy Advisory Council, and we're really proud to be part of all of these different efforts, and we see our role as helping to really thread the needle across these different ideas and strategies so that we can be of support as an agency in helping to build in recommendations that are holistic of the needs of the community and also building upon the voice and the priorities of communities across Vermont. So before we move into the breakout session, because we are a bit of a smaller group, I just wanted to pause to see if you would like to share out anything you notice or wonder based on the data presentation that Amanda just walked through. You can project? Okay. If you would like your mic.
I'd rather not.
You'd rather not,
Can you
okay.
hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Thank you. Appreciate it. I'm trying to reconcile a little bit between what I saw on the slides, the 5 goals for the agency. Yet on the other slide, I think, as we all know, it's the legislature that controls the purse and sets the agenda, really. And I'm just wondering if someone could describe the nature, if there have been any conversations between the agency and the legislature, and I know it's an election year, but to assure people that there's some sense of a consistency and agreement on the 5 goals, as opposed to legislation that may be in the works when the legislature convenes in Montpelier.
So that's a great question. So I'll answer it in a couple different ways. So one, the agency hasn't had a strategic plan in some time. And so there was some work to develop that, I think, before the pandemic, and then with the pandemic, as we all know, things got a little squirrely. And so part of our effort is really to make sure that we're being very focused and aligning our resources, our initiatives, our support and expertise in a way that is going to be most impactful in the field. And so that process has been going on since last spring. As we develop that strategic plan, it's important for us to think about what are some of the immediate priorities that the agency should be supporting now, and how do we position ourselves to support any of the future vision of public education. So I mentioned that we are active participants on all of these committees and commissions, and that's part of our role, is really being immediately responsive to the field, but also anticipating what some of these improvement might be to strengthen our system, to make sure that the agency is aligned with that. We also are, as I mentioned, the repository of all data for our education, and so it's really important that we're able to bring that together in ways that will inform the work of these various committees and could be supportive of data-driven decision-making around legislation that is being considered. And the other piece of that is there has been a lot of new legislation over the past several years. And we're hearing a lot of feedback around the need to support that in very focused ways to achieve fidelity of implementation across the state. And that's a direct function of the agency of what we're looking to support. So we've launched a couple of new initiatives recently, including Read Vermont, to really support recent legislation around improving literacy outcomes statewide and modeling new ways in which we can provide more intensive and on-the-ground support for those efforts. So it's all very connected, and I think in this way, we're trying to meet some immediate needs while also collecting some information that would be helpful for these various committees to inform those broader recommendations. We've been really intentional to try to create synergy where we can, in recognizing that there's some work we need to do now, even before we have that statewide vision, and also recognizing that these conversations bubble up a lot of really important insights and input that we're bringing back. And so we're creating that feedback loop on all those various committees. I think I listed 6 different committees that we're working on to be a partner in that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Question? I think you had a question. Go ahead. Do you want a mic or no?
No, that's okay. Where does curriculum development fit into this whole thing?
Yeah. So we're part of one of the major themes that we heard through the regional planning was a request for stronger direction from the Agency of Education on those things that are most critical to driving student performance. We've heard a lot from our leaders in the field that sometimes it's really challenging if they have to do all of the research and identify all the screeners and things like that. And so we're having that conversation a lot around and framing that. A lot of the input we've received has been framed within the Vermont motto of unity and freedom, and making sure that we achieve a really great balance of that. And in some cases, education leaders and educators are saying we'd actually like more unity in some of these key areas, because that would help us to be really partners with our colleagues across the state. And in some areas, we really need a lot of freedom because there's customization. And so as we're developing our strategic plan at the agency, we've been using the terminology of what are we tight on and what are we loose on, right? And those things that we're tight on are those things that we really are going to align our resources, provide very direct support, and make sure that we can achieve those consistent outcomes. Those things we're loose on, maybe really trying to look at innovation in the field. And then those areas, it's more around guidance and learning for how we can scale some promising practices. So as we go through this work together, part of this is really being clear around what our priorities are as a state so that the work at the agency is aligned to that.
What's the timetable in terms of coming up with whatever recommendations you have?
Yeah, so we have an initial framework which is really structuring how we're focused on these priorities. So we've identified really 4 primary areas that we're focusing on based on the data and based on initial feedback. And through these engagement sessions and further analysis, we're going to be refining our goals and initiatives. So those key areas are promoting literacy and math outcomes, expanding college and career readiness, supporting the mental health needs of our students, and also thinking strategically around sustainability and identifying the budget considerations for long-term sustainability. So those are the areas, and I think as things are kind of becoming more, as we're having these conversations different priorities are emerging. So we are looking to be able to document those and have a plan that, of course, every plan, as a strategic plan, should be a working document, right? But looking to, as we work with our staff at the agency really through the end of the calendar year, we're hoping to have a good draft of that first plan.
You listed 4 objectives, which I can't repeat to you right, but you listed 4. The first was literacy and math, which was covered in the data that was presented. The other 3 weren't presented in the data. Are we collecting data on that, and how do we integrate that into the thinking process?
That's a great question. So as we're looking at college and career readiness, we are diving deeper into that data to really explore utilization of different flexible pathways for our students. So we showed you some trends as it looked at CTE enrollment and some other considerations. So we're going to have a deeper dive in that. As we look at mental health, I would say that's harder to quantify. And there's been a lot of conversations with the field around just understanding what we mean by that and how we're supporting the needs of students. I think a major takeaway is that a lot of the mental health needs in schools are really reflective of broader community needs. And so that's where you heard the theme around creating stronger and tighter school and community connections being an area where we are focusing. And then related to budget and sustainability, we shared kind of high level an understanding of an overview of our education system, and we are going to be providing more reports around that and looking at the Vermont education system in the context of how other states fund education, and so that information will be forthcoming. Yeah, and then we'll break out. I'll take 2 more questions. Yeah.
I don't need the mic. Zoe, I'm just wondering, you're talking about these goals for the state and our students, and I'm wondering where and who might advocate for the Agency of Education to have more staff to be able to look at the data and what's happening on the ground, and who advocates for that, since the governor, you answer to the governor and the governor's budget.
So as we're having these broad conversations around the future of public education, there are considerations around structure, right? And so having conversations around how do we really organize our system in a way to make sure that we're providing the best resources and we're leveraging the expertise of our system to best meet the needs of students. Just as an example, in the community conversation we had earlier with our educators, were saying, you know, I have an expertise in a specific area, but I'm not able to provide support to another district, right? And so those type of things where we start to think about how do we best organize ourselves to really maximize the capabilities. And so those would be considerations as you think about the type of support for the agency as well, and what does that look like when we're really performing at an optimal level. Yes.
I know you're going to do future sessions about kind of working at that financial aspect, but that's kind of where my question is focused now, which is I have only lived in the state for 2.5 years, so the whole like statewide funding is kind of a new experience for me. And one thing that I've been trying to figure out, I guess, is if the funding is kind of distributed equally across the state after it's pooled, what, if anything, is stopping a local district from increasing its programming to meet like the desires of the community or raising its teacher salaries, for instance? When I was in previous districts where it was just locally funded, you get pushback from the local community because that's going to increase their local taxes to cover that programming that you want. But if the cost is maybe going to be distributed across the state, that kind of reduces the burden on the local community to do those things. And so I'm wondering why you don't see as much of a push, even though there's a desire for more programming, I think, for students, or better salaries for teachers. You don't see that push necessarily, even though the cost would be distributed across the state.
One thing I would note, and thank you for your questions. I mean, I think these are all kind of the big questions that everyone's grappling with as we're having these broader conversations. But you know, last year was really unique, and that's, you know, 1/3 of the school budgets did fail, right? And so part of a lot of these conversations is thinking about how do we design a system that provides all the programming we desire for our students at a rate that taxpayers can afford, right? And that's the tension and a lot of what we're exploring as a state. And some of the questions really that we'll have today as we break out is really thinking about that. Like what are some of the suggestions or the ideas and the priorities that we need to consider in that broader conversation. So I appreciate you teeing up some of the breakout discussion. Yeah, one more question and then we'll break out. Yes, yeah.
Thank you. I was just curious, I know that this evening I'm kind of disappointed because I've seen more people at a recent Shasbury School Board meeting than I do here today. And I think it was, communication is key and having enough time to prepare. But I also look at our community needs and knowing that parents are working 1 and 2 jobs or they're alternating because one's working nights, one's working days. Somebody's got to feed and watch the kids. So it makes it very challenging for them to engage in this community. We run into it all the time. Another challenge is that, I'm disappointed because I thought we were going to have a virtual link provided for families to participate, and there wasn't one. So I do want to encourage more communication on those and having more opportunities to provide family voice, because I think that because parents are actually struggling to meet basic needs, including housing, which is hugely significant in this community. A lot of transient populations are affected in schools, and it's very difficult to provide needs based on that.
Yeah.
On this spur of the moment, because we've changed districts where they live. But I do, encourage a lot more communication, because I don't feel that there's a true representation of need or wants or desires here in this county.
Well, thank you. I think that's always a challenge, is making sure that we can promote broad-based participation and really look for your partnership in that and spreading the word around these opportunities. So we have 7 in-person sessions scheduled, and we have 2 virtual sessions also scheduled in November. So make sure that if you did share your email with us today, we can follow up to make sure you have access to that and that you share that information with others that you think would want to be involved and whose voice should be represented in these conversations. So thank you for that, and certainly appreciate your partnership in getting the word out around those opportunities. We've heard an interest in adding more sessions, so that might be something also to stay tuned as we move forward. But this is an opportunity to listen, and there'll be other ways in which folks can engage in this conversation, and we do appreciate you being here. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to move into 2 groups, because we have probably enough to break out into 2 smaller groups. One group will stay in this room, and then one group will be in the cafeteria just on the other side. In each of these, each session will cover the same topics, and we'll focus on getting input from you on how to define student success, to evaluate the types of supports that are needed and those conditions to support student success. And think about the impacts on Vermont's education funding system in all of these considerations. We will have a facilitator for each session, along with a note taker who will be able to capture your thoughts. And as we said at the beginning, we do know that education can really evoke very strong emotions and feelings, and we hope to have a really robust conversation and just ask that everyone be very respectful of different ideas or opinions that are presented, and of course assuming that everyone's coming in with a positive intent of really listening to one another and thinking about ways that we can support Vermont students, schools, and communities. The facilitators will do their best to make sure everyone is able to engage and participate in the conversation. And if you don't feel comfortable sharing your ideas in the group, there will be an opportunity for you to provide input through a survey, and we will share that with you as well. And so at this point, we will break out into groups. So I will ask, how are we going to separate the room here?